I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel of speakers who will draw from their own insights in the worlds of public life, politics, foreign relations, diplomacy and private practice. We're in for an interesting session entitled Integrity in Offshore Business and Offshore Financial Centres. Our first speaker is the Honourable Mr. Barry Griffin, Vice President of the Senate and Senator of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Mr. Griffin, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. So thank you, Dominic, for the very kind introduction, and I would just like to stand on the protocol that has already been established. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You can have a little energy this morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. So as I look around, I see folks and have met folks from around the world, my Caribbean colleagues, and so I bring you warm greetings from the Caribbean and on behalf of the government and the people of the Bahamas. So as introduced, I'm Senator Barry Griffin, Vice President of the Senate and Chief Trade Negotiator for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, a safe harbor for financial services, as we like to moniker ourselves. I stood in this very place exactly 1 year ago, and it is really a distinct pleasure to join you here today. I'm humbled by the invitation, and I readily accepted it this year to engage on such an important and timely topic of integrity in the offshore. So this morning I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are in the Bahamas and why what the world does in the offshore has to be done with integrity. The Bahamas is home to just over 400,000 people, and we have a GDP of roughly $12 billion. This allows the Bahamas to have one of the highest standards of living in the Western Hemisphere. Over 15% of our GDP depends directly on international financial services, and the bulk of the remaining 85% of our GDP depends on foreign direct investment through tourism. A healthy and strong financial system is not just integral to our well-being as a people, it is the lifeline of the Bahamas. This story is mirrored across the Caribbean and in other parts of the world with a strong offshore banking sector. Integrity in the offshore means that a Bahamian entrepreneur should have the same ease of opening a bank account as an entrepreneur in London. Integrity in the offshore means an investor should have the same ease transferring money to Barbados as he would transferring money to Zurich. Integrity in the offshore means an immigrant living in the United States should be able to send money to their loved ones in the Caribbean as easy as it would be for them to spend their money in Paris. And integrity in the offshore means ensuring that financial inclusion is a goal in places like the Caribbean and not just in places like the United States and Europe. And so colleagues, with that as a foundation, on this occasion, I've returned to the University of Cambridge with one simple message. Integrity in the offshore means fairness and equality in the entire global financial system. I'll say it again. Integrity in the offshore means fairness and equality in the entire global financial system. In essence, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. There is a gross inequity at the core of the global financial system with respect to financial integrity, and we must not allow that inequity to persist. So let me explain. In my view, there are two playbooks currently at play. The United States, the United Kingdom, countries in the European Union make rules and regulations that govern their own financial services and banking industries. These rules are informed by no one but them, tested by no one but them, and amended by no one but them. Then, there are the organizations that the West has created, such as the Financial Action Task Force, which have become de facto regulators of banking and financial services in the offshore world. They create lists of these so-called non-cooperative jurisdictions, gray lists and blacklists, and promulgate regulations specifically for offshore jurisdictions, regulations that the United States, Europe, do not follow themselves, but insist on offshore jurisdictions, smaller, more vulnerable economies must follow. So these rules are largely focused on process and form so that even minor missteps lead to inclusion on these lists. And here's where things get interesting. Minor missteps in process or form can land an offshore jurisdiction with the label of non-cooperative But an actual finding of money laundering in the developed world would have no repercussions because these countries are not even eligible for the same scrutiny or penalty. Let's take a recent example. When the world actually wanted to find money launderers in the case of Russian oligarchs evading sanctions, they didn't find them in the Caribbean and the so-called offshore. They found them in New York, London, Zurich. Let that sink in. These Russian billionaires didn't launder their money through small, vulnerable jurisdictions. They took their money to the money capitals of the world. And so while we in a country of 400,000 people and a $12 billion economy can be laden with burdensome enhanced procedures for someone to even open a bank account, the money launderers freely walk in banks in London and New York, Delaware, Luxembourg, Wyoming, and open accounts in minutes, with no repercussions or reputational damages to those jurisdictions. So I think it's time to call a spade a spade. The practice is discriminatory, and as a global community, we must collectively call out this distinction as a discriminatory relic of the past. Colleagues and friends, we must all play by the same rules. If combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism is truly the goal, then two systems cannot exist. The rules everywhere must be the same. Clients everywhere must be subjected to the same rules, forms, processes, and procedures. Separate but equal does not work. We can't drink from different fountains, swim in different pools, live in different neighborhoods, and then say we are equal. We are not. There is a clear divide between what is required in the offshore and what is allowed in the developed world, and it is patently unfair, and dare I say the entire dichotomy lacks integrity. Colleagues, when we look at jurisdictions that are flagged by the Financial Action Task Force and the European Union, certain commonalities emerge. We find European states that operate financial services industries akin to ours are not even scrutinized for inclusion on these lists. We do, however, note that all countries, and I repeat, all countries that are subject to these lists are former colonies of European states, and their economies are small and vulnerable. It's also interesting for us to note that the $3 trillion in estimated money laundering through the developed world is never flagged as a cause for concern. But minor missteps in process or form leads to economic Armageddon, with our jurisdictions experiencing serious reputational damage. The evidence is mounting. These lists and the separate playbook for offshore jurisdictions seem to have less to do with compliance and more to do with some sort of unconscious bias. And so today, as we speak on integrity, we in the so-called offshore world ask that we also speak on fairness and equity. This, in my estimation, is the only way forward. Fairness for all, equity for all, integrity by all. And so the truth is, if integrity in financial services is truly the goal, then a fairer and more equal global financial services system should be the target. To truly combat economic crime, we must all be on the same page. And so this is my plea. And this is the plea being echoed louder and louder by leaders across the globe. Prime Minister Philip Davis of the Bahamas at the UN General Assembly last year called for the universal jurisdiction of the United Nations to bring some semblance and balance of the equity. And earlier this year, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, in a United States congressional hearing, detailed bank de-risking as a direct consequence of these unequal rules being placed on vulnerable jurisdictions. Colleagues, the beauty of symposiums like these is the mix of presenters and attendees that it attracts, from politicians and policymakers like myself to international bankers, lawyers, noted academics, and more. We're able here in these environments to dissect and discuss these complex issues from all angles. And I hope that through my presentation, you have been able to see this issue from an aspect that you may not have previously before. And beyond what I've already said, I hope that you are also beginning to see this issue not just as a matter of policy, but rather one of justice and human rights. Financial inclusion is now widely considered a human right. If a citizen in today's world is to live without fear of personal attack, is to live in the capitalist society that we have built, he must have access to banking, to store his money, to save his money, to invest his money, to spend his money, to trade his money for goods and services. It then follows that this basic right is not just reserved for the person living in North America or continental Europe. This is a right of every person on the planet. We in the Caribbean know that financial inclusion is the backbone of our economic development. Access to international trade, finance, remittances, they all promote economic stability and create growth opportunities for governments and citizens alike. But the medium that makes it possible, correspondent banking relationships, is consistently restricted or terminated. And no region is more affected than the Caribbean. And so when these organizations promote new regimes of compliance and they shift the goalposts year by year, all of our jurisdictions comply because our economies depend on it. But here's what happens. When it becomes harder, more stringent, more timely, and more costly to open a bank account in Bermuda or Belize than it is in Luxembourg or Zurich, banks leave. The Bahamas is a testament to that. Barbados is a testament to that. International banks are leaving every day, not because the jurisdictions are bad, but simply it's becoming too expensive to comply with international regulations. And when banks leave, our people are left outside of the established traditional banking sector. Colleagues, when you kneecap the ability of our people to earn an honest living in good paying sectors such as financial services, you increase hardships in our countries. When you make it harder for banks to exist in our countries and not yours, you take away the ability for our people to survive and compete on a global standard. Our economies are affected and the quality of life of our people are affected. And so I submit to you today that integrity in what you do in the offshore is a global public good. An equal level of robust scrutiny is required all over the world, not just the offshore world, if integrity in our entire financial system is the goal. Economic crime is not morally wrong if it happens in Cayman, but acceptable if it happens in Cornwall. Clients must face the same scrutiny no matter where they decide to park their money, and regular people must have the same access to financial services wherever they live, whether it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines or Zurich. The days of unfair and biased rules and unjust sanctions must simply come to an end. We know better, so we must do better. The Bahamas is one of the most highly regulated jurisdictions in the world. I think many of you in this room would be shocked at the level of due diligence, KYC, and compliance that law firms, banks, and even real estate companies in the Bahamas must undertake. Integrity is at the center of all business that we do. And we believe that there's no real evidence or data to support the top-heavy sanctions imposed on offshore jurisdictions, especially as opposed to jurisdictions like Delaware, Wyoming, London, New York, that do the exact same work that we do and service the same clients that we do. I know, I'm an attorney in the financial services sector, and we normally correspond with law firms all over the world where we share clients. So it's a myth that the offshore shields anyone from being involved in unlawful practices, as is evidenced by our compliance with all the very rules that you make. Our jurisdictions are guided by the rule of law, funny enough, by the legal systems that you here in Europe have left in our countries, with the final court of appeal in some instances being right here in the UK, as the Bahamas is with the Privy Council. We comply with all rules in a changing regulatory environment. There's no issue with that. We simply do not wish to be brought to our economic knees by anti-competitive practices. One set of rules for all, that's all that we ask. Fairness, equity, integrity in all business, not just offshore business. That is our plea. And so colleagues, with that, I trust that I ruffled some feathers today, but hopefully not so much that I'm not invited back next year. And so to the organizers of this symposium and this panel today, I continue to give you kudos for doing a good job, for allowing us the space in this forum to discuss these much needed issues from all angles. Integrity is and should be the backbone of any financial system. This integrity should be across the board, creating an environment of fairness and equality for all. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Barry, for those insights and bringing in the Bahamas perspective to this discussion.